I want to go slow on this. I always go too quick. I cut off sentences. Um, I say too quick, but I don't think in general it's a particularly bad thing. I mean, it's just the way I do it. I think it's comprehensible. Um, Sometimes, you might have to spend time figuring out what the end of the sentences were and stuff. Uh, but in another sense, it's just too quick. Um, so I want to take my time, right? Go the pace of my heart or my stomach or something. Um, I go a pace that's normal for me, but it's like a falsetto or something. You know what I mean? You can make this higher pitch. It can be useful in some cases. So, I mean, I'm not saying I don't like that I go at that tempo. In general, I'm saying that for some that it does that it does distract from the message, right? And it's important to be of a natural pace where you're calm, right? To breathe. And I don't necessarily associate that with video making. Video making for me is something like jotting things down, right? There's no real rules about it. Whatever you can get down without interfering with what you think. But, I've been going through these terms, and this is a very, very important one. Um, so the other terms I've been going through, let's see, philosophy, the verb, to philosophize, is, I'm saying, the contemplation of things consciously, right? There seems to be unconscious contemplation. We get all these ideas spewing out of this unconscious contemplation. So it seems to be a thing. And philosophy is basically consciously contemplating things. Um, and what are those things but the things that just appears to be this is the case. Our brain says it appears it's morning, and we're like, I guess it must be morning. And we are contemplating those. And sometimes, uh, with skepticism, we're dealing with how appearances sometimes are wrong or whatever. They're not what they appear. Things turn out to be different than they at first appeared. And skepticism is the idea that, well, that's going to keep happening. You can always find out more about appearances. Appearances are going to change. And this creates this, progression of appearances uh, and a relative metric for which appears more certain, right? So something appeared to be the case, but then we found out something else that appeared to be the case more and overrides that old thing, and then we believe that, and then it goes on and on. And even though things are not as they appear, there is a progression, there's progress to the appearance being more and more accurate. And then I went through materialism, which is, basically just a logical consequence idea. And the reason I say this is because since we have this sort of skeptical or whatever, whoever is to blame, whatever the philosophy name would be for the fact that we don't know. It could be that the universe was created 30 seconds ago with all the fossils in place. It could have been, we are in Vishnu's dream. We could be in a matrix. The fact that anything that's functionally equivalent to generating our experiences is a possible universe, well, then materialism can't be an idea of, hey, dirt is dirt, or no, dirt is a computer code, or no, dirt is an attitude of the Vishnu's brain that you're dreaming, or dirt is this or that or the other, whatever. Dirt is dirt. We can find out more about what, dirt is. What we know is that if you're buried underneath dirt, you won't be able to breathe. There's material consequences to physical and other situations, right? A thumbprint on a piece of glass means that a person touched that piece of glass, right? And that's what it means to have a materialism, is material links between things. And then relativism turns out to be where you get your facts in the first place, right? What you're going to start with is comparisons, and comparisons are relationships. Which is taller? This one's taller. Those sorts of comparisons is how you get, distance. This is 3 feet away. That means if I took a ruler that's a foot long, it's 3 of those away. I'm comparing the distance between the two things to the size of a ruler, right? And that's how all measurement works. And that's relativistic. So that's where you get these facts that you start from. The velocity of these cars and between each other and the pavement and leaving the skid marks, and that's how I decode what happened in the accident or the car crash. That's relativism. And it's my starting point for a materialistic series of consequences. All right, so those are the predecessors. And now I'm talking about spirituality. Okay, so spirituality relative to those other concepts, right? With respect to, in relation to those other concepts. Okay, and I mentioned earlier, spirituality is comprised of your philosophy of being a living thing, first of all, of being a living thing, that you're a living thing, your consciousness, your philosophy about what that is all about, how that works. And also your philosophy about other living things, right? So in that sense, it'll encompass your philosophy about empathy and cooperation and individuality, right, in contrast to these things. And with respect to your philosophy of being a living thing. And what does that really mean? To me, all comes from the being a living thing part, right? You have this series of emotions and feelings that impact you, and you, as a human, you're kind of programmed, it would seem, to think that other humans have that same series of feelings, and probably that all mammals do, and all birds, and all animals, and in my case, I would just say all living things have this stream of consciousness, right, of various details, and different animals have different palettes of emotion and whatnot. And spirituality, I think, is your philosophy of living things. You being a living thing, and the fact that you believe other things are living as well. And if you don't, or whatnot, or you have some sort of, whatever, special case, you still have a philosophy of what it means for you to be a living thing, or at least you act out a pattern of behavior that could be philosophized about, that could be thought of consciously, even if you haven't thought of it consciously. It could be analyzed consciously. There could be a statement given to it, which would basically pass as, a philosophy of the way you behave. Somebody else might need to be conscious about it. Maybe you refuse to be conscious about it. Now, what's important about this with relation to those other terms is that the spirit, the thing that is experiencing being a living thing, it's the thing that to which things matter, right? This consequence of one thing is the true of facts leads to another thing that must be true facts, leads to another thing that must be true facts that matter, that have a material consequence. Well, to who? To a living thing, right? So your spirituality is fundamental to the fact that things matter at all, right? To anyone. It's hard to describe that things matter to. There's a boulder there. Does it matter if it's raining or not? It seems to be that it matters to a living thing whether it's raining or not, right? Like in the living things living in a little tunnel, a dry little tunnel underneath the rock. So it's like, hey, it doesn't matter. Okay, it takes a living thing for it to not matter. It no more not matters than it does matter to the rock, as far as, is imaginable by me. It takes a living thing. For it to matter to the rock would be to imply the rock is a living thing, which, some people do. I don't. It is to the living thing that things appear. When we're talking about skepticism and things aren't exactly what they appear, it is to a living thing that things appear in the first place. Again, to the rock, it seems that things don't appear. Or the things that do appear, like the light and heat that, land on the rock and heat it or whatever, or, they're not felt by the rock in the same sense as they would be by a living thing. They're not acknowledged. They're just, the results of them are performed, right? They're not processed with the thought process that a living thing would have, at least a human, and probably mammals and birds and reptiles, and I believe every living thing, to some degree, has this chain of appearances based on what they can sense and what they can't, right? And in philosophy itself, this consciousness contemplation, I don't really know where you would put the consciousness, right? I don't tend to think that it has to do with the complexity of your mind. To me, that's the amount of processing you can accomplish. How deep and how abstract, how many parentheses can you have in a concept before you lose track? Okay? Intelligence. I think that is limited, obviously, variously in different living things, including humans, but I think we're doing pretty good, but, limited. But the actual idea that it's consciousness, that the living thing is contemplating something, and that's what it's like, that's what it's aware of, right? Obviously, it takes a living thing to do that. Possibly only a human, or possibly only an ape, possibly only a mammal, or possibly only one of the vertebrates, or possibly who knows where it goes. But we could stick with humans and assume that it might, be more than humans, that these contemplations that we experience are phenomena of living things. The rock doesn't have this contemplation, can't have a conscious contemplation, because it's not really contemplating. It's more like a storage device. It stores the information some of the information about what it has gone through, right? It's if you pick up a rock and it's really hot, it's like, well, I know it's gone through being in a energized environment, probably a hot environment, or maybe a laser struck it or whatever. It has experienced something that made it hot. It can store that, but it's not contemplating experiencing being warmed up, right? It takes a living being. In other words, spirit. Spirit traditionally just means the quality that something has, the property of being alive. Okay, and things don't actually break down into being alive. What you have is a system that the way it behaves is a behavior called being alive. That's different from it's a thing and it's got a property of being alive and now the property's gone. No, it's a behavior like a internal combustion engine that's running versus now it won't run. And so spirituality is just your philosophy of being one of these living things, as well as your philosophy of how you treat and what you think of other living things, which of course, encompasses your empathy and sympathy or lack thereof, your competitiveness, all the relationships you have to other living things. And it relates to everything. It basically is your worldview because that's ultimately what the whole world is to you, is your life as a living thing in relationship to other living things. And that's why, you know, spirituality doesn't have to have anything to do with believing in a God or not. You can be agnostic for all that matters. It has to do with how you think of being a living thing, spiritual in the metaphysical sense or not. In my case, it's not. I don't think there is any metaphysics. But if you do, fine. It's still like a devout Christian's spiritual views are their views on being a living thing, how to behave and whatnot, and their attitude about other living things, having sympathy or not, or you're all sinful or not, whatever they happen to pull out of that. It's their attitude about living things, what it means to be a living thing, what your responsibilities are as a living thing. That's what spirituality is. It's really that simple. And is it metaphysical or not? Well, people have chosen to make it metaphysical like they've chosen to make a lot of other things metaphysical. I don't think it's metaphysical. I think it's, metalogical. It affects everything else that you do in at least a subtle way. Because it's your view on how people should act, how you should act towards people, what it's like to be a person, how, all of your pettier emotions, as well as every higher emotion, as well as when you feel devoid of emotion. And that's why it's important. You can't not have a view on what it's like to be a living thing, what it's like to deal with other living things. That's the most ever present situation that we humans are in. We're communal animals. There's a bunch of other living human beings around us. And you really can't get away with like not having an idea about what it all means. So something weird's happening on my screen. So anyway, you have to have a spiritual attitude. That's what that means, right? What do you think about living things? Like if you think all living things should just stop living, and you're some destructo natalist, that's your spirituality, because that's your view on living things. Fine, but you can't not have a perspective on it, because there's really, if you did, it's like a window. If you don't have a view on this, then everything else you think you have a view on is, how do you get there? Why does it matter? Relative to what? How does it appear in the first place? Right, cheers.